Once was a swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. As he sat, as he watched and waited while his billy boiled, who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnie Luks at the Crossroads, and we've got an interesting forum today. We're down a bit on our forum staff, but I'd like to welcome our forum member for today, Betty Luks. Welcome, Betty.
Oh, thank you, Annie, and good morning.
Good morning. Okay, the area we wanted to discuss today, I would describe as um, a theory or a scientific method of attempting to come to or formulate a line of inquiry and then perhaps come to a theorem. And I need to actually establish words and I need to establish precedents where theories have been presented and then transposed into fact and where an argument has come about. And I'm going to start with this bloke, Copernicus. And Copernicus, of course, presented his theorem, that the Earth rotates around the Sun. The Earth rotates around the Sun, not the Sun rotating around the Earth. And his theorem, his idea of what was going on through his observations, it actually says in this article, were actually observed and presented 18 centuries. In other words, before Christ, 300 years before Christ, a bloke was actually Aristarchus of Samos was actually presenting it that this was his point of view, that the Earth was travelling around the sun. Now, the church had a different position, but the thing is that the church accepted Copernicus's point of view, accepted it on the basis that, okay, Copernicus, this is a theorem, and it's a method where we can actually look and observe, and we don't accept it as conclusive fact, but we accept it as a theorem. Now, Galileo came along, and Galileo presented the same point of view. But then he insisted that it was fact. And of course, that was the position where the church resisted his position. And it's interesting that my understanding of this debate has actually evolved over the last few weeks. And it's evolved from being that perhaps the church was wrong to perhaps the church was right. Now, I need to actually present some words here, and let's try and work our way through words because I'm going to try and, if you like, lay the foundation for us to continue this discussion. Now, the first word is the word theory, a coherent group of tested general propositions, commonly regarded as correct, that can be used as principles of explanation. Most important that we look at that. It's not fact, it's a theory. It's principles of explanation and prediction for a class of phenomena. So that's the word theory. And then we go theory for synonyms, and we look at these different synonyms. Now, notice here the word theory, and the noun for the word theory is hypothesis. Hypothesis or belief, a theory. And so we look at the word theory or hypothesis, and we look like, to me, they look like brother-sister words, and that they're really saying the same thing, just a different grammatical connotation. And then these other words of approach, argument, idea, suspicion, the grounds or supposition, supposal, presumption, these all help us present an understanding. Now I look here in the word dogma, and dogma to me does not bring about the same relevance to a situation as theorem. To me, theorem is something that's plastic, and the actual outworking, the observable phenomena, um, allows you to massage a theorem, whereas dogma does not. That's a dedicated position and it's irrefutable. Now, I want to actually present two more points before we actually open the floor to Betty, and that is the inductive approach or inductive reasoning. Now, my interpretation of what this word says is that essentially you start with a blank piece of paper and you look at the phenomena in your research, and it's a research process. And as you take into account your observations, this inductive approach, it allows you to actually build a theorem because of the observations, and you continue to test the theorem. And I think that it's an interesting point of view, and as I understand it, this is how science, genuine science, works. There is another approach, and that is a deductive approach. And the deductive, from my reading of it, is that you actually come to a, if you like, a firm conclusion prematurely, and then everything else has to fall into that conclusion. And I think that the deductive approach is not necessarily scientific. And that's my understanding. I've laid the groundwork and I'm open to critique. I'll hand the floor over to Betty. Betty.
Mm. Well, Arnie, I'm not sure that I agree with everything that you've said there, but I just want to come back to my thoughts on this because I've been thinking of it for the last couple of weeks. I just listened again to Jordan Peterson and his comments about the dominance hierarchy of a social order and the pyramidal structure that he points out is how that it developed the social order, and his idea of the order and chaos that there is in the world. And uh, and I was a bit troubled by all of those understandings, because I thought, well, hold on. If we're going to look at those all of those questions, we need to understand what the philosophy is behind it. And what prompted me to think along those lines is that here in Australia we have a new Prime Minister, and Scott Morrison. And Scott Morrison is on record as saying that he attends a Pentecostal church in Sydney, and he's on record as saying that you can't find the policies, um, political policies, in the Bible, or words to that effect. I really should have made sure I had the exact wording, because wording is so important. But anyhow, um, I thought about all of that and I thought, no, hold on. First of all, we have to look at the Christian religion. Don't tell me that the Christian religion doesn't have a philosophy. Of course, it has a philosophy. The concept of creation and all of that is based on a philosophy. And when it comes to the dominance hierarchy of Peterson, then I think of the importance of history and the time slot in history when Christ was incarnated, when Jesus Christ was incarnated, and the gift of the Holy Spirit, which is recorded in the New Testament. And this has to do with the evolution or development of mankind. And then again, I was thinking of McGilchrist and Tweedy and their books, The God of the Left Hemisphere and The Master and His Emissary, and thinking of the importance of understanding the differences between the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. And all of these thoughts were coming to me, and I'm thinking, they all have to be unpacked, because how on earth are we ever going to understand where or what the situations are in the world today unless we understand that? I think of the pyramidal structure that um, Peterson refers to. And in history, it was shown that the pyramidal structure was the collectivist structure, it was the centralization of power, and Christianity is opposed to the centralization of power. And this idea of order and chaos, well, if you go back to the Christian teaching in the Athanasian Creed, and that was formulated around about 500 AD, then of course it's pointing out that there is not order and chaos, that in the very essence of things, which of course is the ultimate reality, the reality of God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that there is mutual love and cooperation. There is uh, there is diversity. Um, there is love. There's not order and chaos, and the order and chaos is usually it comes about because of how man has organized his social structure.
Mm,
I think that we have to give it much more thought and discussion.
thank you for that, Betty. That's a very good opening salvo. And that is that the when we talked about the inductive and deductive, and the theorems that go with things. And we look at the evolution of thinking, we look at the development of thinking, especially from a Christian perspective. When Jesus came, Jesus as God the Son presented truth, and it was such profundity that it caused a challenge to the structure of society, to the structure of the individual, and to even our way of thinking. And I'm going to bring up an illustration here because I think it's important. And when you talk about mutual love and cooperation, and you look at the dominance hierarchy is not like this. The dominance hierarchy essentially has a power of the elite or the upper group over the rest of society. And so there is no, in a sense, it's one of power. Whereas in this illustration here of the triquetra, it shows one of interrelatedness and balance. And I might point out to you, at least figuratively speaking, that in a dictatorship, you have the dominance hierarchy, you have this pyramid of power. Whereas in a limited constitutional monarchy, you have decentralization of power, you have division of power, and you actually limit the power of government. And so you don't have the dominance of government. Now, we can see the dominance, if you like, we've discussed it in this forum about the Chinese social credit system, of where the elite control 1,400 million people, and they control them on the minute by minute daily basis. That's the dominance hierarchy. Whereas the history, if you like, the culture that we inherited, the Christian culture we inherited, is one of you are free to do whatever you choose, providing you don't harm someone else. Only do unto him what you'd have him do unto you, and then you're free to do everything else. Completely different from the dominance hierarchy. And it is shown up diagrammatically. I mean, the triquetra was actually something that as I understand it, the Celts drew up, and it was a reflection of reality as they saw it. It wasn't. It wasn't um, a deductive position. It was an inductive. It was an evolving, continue on with the thinking, continue on with the development, and then in the end, you come up with a theorem. And that's really what the triquetra is about. It's a theorem of how we understand the nature of God, the nature of this world, the nature of life. And I could give you many illustrations of the Trinity in action. Um, but I won't at the moment. I'll bring it back to Betty and let her continue.
Thank you, Arnie. Well, I, of course, want to again mention Mr. Peterson. And I genuinely think that he's genuine and he is seeking, because after all of these subjects that we're referring to go back to different disciplines. And I don't know how far he's thought about these things when it comes to his philosophy of life. But in one of his discussions, he mentioned that the highly intelligent people should be at the top of the pyramid. And I thought, well, just a moment. Are you telling me that criminals are not highly intelligent? And so there has to be a balance. There is the intelligence, but there's also the responsibility and the accountability. It's not just the dominance hierarchy. So and this to me is what the English speaking peoples understood, and that's why they separated and divided power. And what's happening now is that we are going back the other way. And another point was made by C.H. Douglas, if I remember rightly, when he pointed out that great men are often quite evil. So I don't quite share Peterson's viewpoint on that. I think he's got to add some other factors into his account.
Thank you for that.
And
Thank you for that, Betty. I'm just going to jump in here and highlight to our listeners that in Australia, it is a custom within our public service, and even the word public service is that all bureaucrats are referred to as public servants. And that's because we have a Christian document called a constitution. It is a Christian constitution, and it's on the basis that he who would be greatest must be a servant. If you want to be greatest, you've even got to be a slave to all. That's what's Christian, not the dominance hierarchy. And so it's actually an inversion of the Christian philosophy. So, Scott Morrison, you saying that Christianity hasn't got anything to do with policy, shame on you. You don't even know your Bible. Betty.
Well, can we blame Scott Morrison, or do we blame those who supposedly teach Christians about the Christian faith? And I mean the true faith. And that brings me back to this word deduction. Induction, I understand in the sense that it has to go through the experimental methods to determine whether it is correct or not, this inductive theory. But when it comes to deduction, I think the best way is to give an example that a chap called Robertson did in a book that we carry in our library and in our retail, Human Ecology and Social Credit. And it's a chap by the name of Tom Robertson. And Tom, what he did was he was influenced by the work of C.H. Douglas, but he went on to examine um, the various social mechanisms. And his idea was to examine the different mechanisms, and I'm talking about parliament and financial system. I'm talking about those things that influence us every day of our lives. And he put them through the test that if they worked as they were people thought they worked, as a gun when it is fired works, then such and such would happen. But of course what he showed was that the mechanism does not work as it should. And of course, Douglas makes the point that all organizations tend towards evil, and that to join an organization, you must be sure that you understand what it's about, and that you agree with its objectives, and that you see that the objectives are being obtained. Whereas we look at what's happening to our world today, and they are not being obtained. And so, therefore, we have to look at more than just the systems as we see them. We have to analyze them. We have to go back to our philosophy. We have to go back to our understanding of the difference between an inductive theory and a deductive theory. We have to use our own brains.
Okay, I'm just going to cut across to a website here I've just brought up. This is the Veritas Books website. And we've got here the Human Ecology and Social Credit, the Legacy of Tom Robertson, this little booklet on the right. And so these are actually available through Veritas Books if you choose to avail yourself so that you can continue on with further reading. The fact is that, and it is a fact, what we're doing here is we're attempting to educate ourselves and we're attempting to transpose that information so it's in a form that may allow you to actually develop your thinking. We're not static beings, and the more we study this thing called Christianity or social credit, it's the same thing. The more we study it, the more we realize that it's so relevant for today. And the fact is, we do ourselves and our, if you like, our community and our civilization a huge disservice by not going after these truths and putting in the scholarship that's necessary. Because the more we do put in, the more we actually unpack, the more we reveal that there are truths there for us. And from those truths, we can actually present what is the gospel, the relevance of the gospel in the circumstances of the day. Otherwise, the Christianity is just a set of ideas, and it's not just a set of ideas. It permeates everything, and it permeates. If we let it, it can actually permeate our thinking, so that we can decipher the meanings that are out there. Betty Luks.
Mm, yes, Arnie, how true that is. I think of again. I'm coming back to Scott Morrison. He has no understanding of what Christians once understood about these things. Because, for instance, we do have a prototype. We have a prototype of the metaphysical structure of this creation. And where do you find that? A metaphysical reality? Where do you find that? You find that in the doctrine of the Trinity. And Athanasius said it very well when he said, "And in this Trinity, none is before or after the other, none is greater or less than another." And it goes on to say, "neither confounding the persons nor dividing the substance." And I would see how that would apply to our world today, where you have politicians who have more loyalty to foreign nations than they do to their own people and their own nation. More loyalty to the United Nations than to the people of this nation. And these things are absolutely basic. So, Scott Morrison, I think you need to do some homework if you're going to go and flout yourself as being a Christian. And I'm reminded of that in history. I can remember when Jimmy Carter was campaigning in America, how it was emphasized that he was a Christian. Really? Really? His policies did not show that, and his actions did not show that. He was a typical politician as far as I was concerned. So, you know, words themselves are important. Think about it. And if you're going to understand what the difference between induction and deduction, study those words. Um, it was pointed out by C.H. Douglas that Francis Bacon was the one who he was not a scientist, but he he worked out this method of reasoning, which we call the inductive um, method of reasoning, and scientists use that to great advantage. But then you had C.H. Douglas come to the stage where he could see that, yes, men understood that and were using it, but science became, as I see that McGilchrist points out, that science or the scientific approach became the dominant um, left hemisphere of the brain policy, you could say,
Mm,
because Douglas went on to say that he thought that the time had come when the overgrowth, this overgrowth of industrialization, should be cut back because it was all the material world and not the metaphysical,
mm,
not the truth that Christianity was endeavoring to show, the balanced truth that is available.
Thank you for that, Betty. I was visualizing inductive and deductive as you were mentioning it, and I thought, what better example than climate change? What better example? The United Nations and all the chief scientists are saying this is settled science. This is settled science. And every situation is attempted to be fitted into the narrative that the climate is changing and that the world is getting hotter, when in actual fact it's not. It hasn't for the last 50 years, and even though we've had 150, 300 years of industrialization, the world is not getting hotter. And our satellite data shows that it's not getting hotter. But inductively, inductively means that you actually use the Weather Bureau, the meteorology, the sampling that you're taking, the raw data, not manipulated data, your observations, you take these things into account and you place the theorem. Is the world getting hotter or not? Are we actually having an influence over the climate on the Earth? And to me, the theorem of climate change, perhaps you could say there may be to a tenth or a 20th decimal place some indication, but certainly nothing that your sensible feelings can actually tell the difference of. I mean, the variability in temperature today may be 8 to 10, whatever, degrees. 8 to 10 degrees just across the day. And this is just a normal spring day. You try it across summer and you might start below 20 and go up to over 40. So it could be 20 plus degrees. And you're going to measure to a hundredth or a thousandth or a 10,000th or a millionth of a degree and be able to sensibly tell the difference. This is the deductive approach. This is why it is so flawed, because they're trying to fit the narrative of global warming into the science. And of course, they're spending hundreds of billions of dollars to substantiate it because the end objective is world government. But come back to the science, the raw data, and your own observations. Go outside. Don't listen to the brainwashing. Go outside and have a look. Use your inductive method. Blank sheet of paper. Is it hotter today than it was yesterday? Have we come to a conclusion on that? I don't think so. I think what we've got is we've got a theorem on the table, and it needs to be plasticized because we haven't come to the end of this discussion at all. It is not settled science. And in fact, if science is settled, it's not science at all. It's dogma. Betty Lukes.
Mm. Well, Arnie, I think of what Tom Robertson had to say in his little book, Human Ecology and Social Credit. And he uses the example of a young boy as presenting certain symptoms. And of course, it is that he's lethargic, he's overweight, he likes too much sugar, and wastes his time, does all this sort of thing. And of course, the persons who look at him deduce that he is just lazy and doesn't do enough exercise and whatever. But the experimental um, way it should be approached, and Tom approaches us that way, is that you have to look at what are the symptoms. And it turns out that the boy who appears lazy and all of that is in fact suffering from diabetes. Now, what they're doing is they're approaching the symptoms and not getting to the causes. And that's what he does in his little booklet when he deals with the seven social mechanisms, and what we do when we should do when we look at the inductive method.
Thank you for that, Betty. I'm just going to, in a sec, sorry, I haven't brought me up. I'm going to call for closing comments because we're at the almost 28-minute mark. But I just wanted to highlight a couple of things before we move away from this discussion, and that is our website, a new time survey. I spent a lot of time preparing this article, so I really would like you to read it. And there's no tick boxes or likes or anything like that. It's just a matter of imparting the learning that I've gone through for this month. That's what that's about. And I'll also highlight that we've opened up a new video channel. Mike Adams from naturalnews.com has produced an alternative site to YouTube. It's called Real.video, and you'll find us there under Douglas Social Credit. And we've got the first 28 videos. I worked over the weekend to get them uploaded, and we'll continue on to upload as time allows. And this is our YouTube channel here, and as you can see, there's actually 92 videos there, and that's an opportunity. That's the work that we've put in, and when I say we, I mean this goes back to the 80s. Some of these videos were actually done in the 80s, 2014 with Oliver, and to me that's most important, that you're actually harvesting a huge inheritance there of study and scholarship and information. And to me it's important. None of this has come easy. It's only probably seriously study in the last year, and I've catapulted my thinking. It's not where it was. It was, in a sense, fairly staid. It wasn't static, but it was staid. It was really just loping along in cruise mode. Whereas I've put the effort in this year to read, to listen, to learn, to debate, to discuss, and it's evolved. My thinking has evolved. So, closing comments, Betty.
Well, my closing comment is going to be going back to C.H. Douglas, and this is in 1956 in the Social Creditor that the discussion was about the induction and deduction. And Douglas pointed out in the brief for the prosecution that actually, that what they were dealing with was this word equality, and I was reminded of it by Peterson again in a discussion that's on YouTube, and he was looking at the difference between equality of outcome and equality of output, and pointing out that one would require a huge bureaucracy to bring it into effect, and that's the clever part of it. But this is what Douglas had to say. If the world is reduced to molecules, this equality, ultimately we can dispense with a catalogue and a dictionary. All things are the same, and all words are just sound molecules in motion. That is the ultimate meaning of equality, having no quality. And that is the importance of going back to the original meaning of words so that we don't get confused when we're presented with these policies.
Okay, thank you for that, Betty. I'm reminded with your comments there when we talk about equality and quality. I know that I used to enjoy the rivalry. It was mateship rivalry at work, and we would actually egg each other on for within the refining uh, industry. We'd egg each other on to actually improve our performance, and a Monday's performance was different from a Friday, and it was also one man's performance on a Monday was different than another man's performance on a Monday, and all of the variabilities in between. And over the years, I got better. I didn't start at a level, I actually finished at that level, and it actually peaked and probably was on a downhill slope because of age it was catching up in the end. But all of those things are variabilities. It's not a one size fits all. We've got to look at these things and we've got to take them into account on the day, and even the things such as words. What do I actually mean? When someone says something to me, what am I actually thinking? This to me is all part of it, and there is no, there's no such thing as hard and fast. Dogma is wrong. Even the word dogma, what does it mean? To me, dogma is wrong because it's fixed, it's static, it's an end position before you start. And the fact is, all of your thinking has got to be, if you like, fluid, but firm around those truths, those theorems, those things that work. Those things that work. That's what this is about. Those things that work. This is Arnie Luks at the Crossroads. Once was a swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. As he sat, as he watched and waited while his billy boiled, will come a waltzing Matilda with me.